Hello, and welcome to the Trailblazers of New Hampshire LGBTQ plus Voices Through Time webinar. My name is Holly Cashman, and I use she and they pronouns, and I'll be moderating the webinar this afternoon or this morning, depending on where you're joining us from. I'm a professor of Spanish linguistics and core faculty in women's and gender studies at UNH, and I'll start off by wishing everyone a happy LGBTQ plus History Month and an early happy National Coming Out Day, which is Friday of this week. My research focuses on conducting oral histories as part of the New Hampshire Seacoast LGBT History Project, and I've just started a new project collecting oral histories of LGBTQ plus faculty, staff, and alums at the University of New Hampshire. So I would love to hear from anyone interested in taking part in either of those projects. Having grown up as a queer person in the 1980s without much access to representation in history books or in the media, I've become passionate about uncovering and sharing local LGBTQ plus history, which is why this webinar and our two panelists are near and dear to my heart. In just a second, I will introduce, or I'll turn things over to Tom Caulfield and Carrie Moorhead to introduce themselves. But before I do that, I just wanted to invite everyone to put your questions that you have for our panelists in the chat. We'll definitely make sure to reserve at least 15 minutes for Q&A at the end of the webinar. So please, throughout the webinar, as you think of them, please put your questions into the chat so that we can have the panelists respond to you. Okay, now on to our panelists. I'll invite you both to introduce yourselves. They are both UNH alums and trailblazers in New Hampshire LGBTQ plus history, and I'm eager for them to tell you more about themselves. Tom, do you want to start?
Sure. Thank you very much, Holly. My name is Tom Caulfield. I use he and him. I'm an 82 graduate from the College of Engineering and Physical Sciences. And I was not out when I was at UNH, just so you know that. But I started the Seacoast LGBTQ History Project on the Seacoast of New Hampshire in 2015, mainly because I had items from when we worked on an equal rights ordinance in Portsmouth in 1993. So I had a lot of ephemera from that, bumper stickers and buttons and newsletters, and I didn't really want to throw them away. And I'd gotten to know some of the people at the Portsmouth Athenaeum, which is a private library slash museum, and they were willing to store the items that I collected. So I started in 2015, and our goal was to collect, preserve, and present the artifacts and stories of the LGBT people on the seacoast of New Hampshire. We were all volunteers, so and none of us were historians. We're just interested in history, and all were members of the LGBTQ community. So we really wanted to start collecting items and sharing our stories. And I start by saying that when I started it, people were like, "You really have to talk about UNH and the UNH story." And I was like, let them tell their story. There's a lot of stories we have to tell. And then as we started doing our research, we found that the story at UNH with the gay student organization in '73 and being defunded and was really a catalyst for a lot of things. And we started looking to do our research. We really were just like hunting around anywhere for online resources. And one of the things we stumbled upon was at the University of Southern Maine, they have a very large online LGBTQ history. So we started going through the newsletters there, just researching, like searching for Portsmouth or New Hampshire and see what came up on the newsletters. And one of the groups that we found was the Seacoast Area Gay Alliance, which Wayne April, who was instrumental in starting the GSO at UNH, also started that group, and it was from like 1974 to 1978. And we found that they met in Portsmouth. And actually, when Wayne was here for the 50th anniversary in 2023, I asked him what they had accomplished, and he said not much, but they had a lot of potlucks, but it was a lot of networking. at the time in the mid 70s. And we actually, a number of us ended up going up to the University of Southern Maine. We actually, Holly and I went into their archives there, and we spoke to some of the people there that were involved in their GSO, and they were watching what was happening at UNH in the 70s and just seeing what was going to happen, see if the GSO would be successful. Um, and so fortunately it was. So we include that now in my walking tour that I do in Portsmouth. I'll just quickly tell you where we're at right now. We collected a ton of stuff, a lot of stuff, and some of it, the Athenaeum, again, which is a private library museum, it is open to the public for research. They did not want any audio or video, and they did not want, they didn't really want any of the hard physical artifacts like banners and hats and T-shirts. It's not really what they're good at storing. They're good at storing paper. So since the beginning of the project, we've gotten the Portsmouth Public Library involved, and they now store all of our audio and video archives. And we also have gotten the Portsmouth Historical Society involved, and they're going to start storing all of our hard artifacts like T-shirts and hats and signs and banners. There's a couple things that when we were going throughout this project, when we were doing research, and a couple things struck me. One was how often the Seacoast made national news, and by national I mean like it made Boston papers, not necessarily on CBS with Walter Cronkite, but there were so many things that were going on in the Seacoast. I could name a couple. One was, of course, the GSO at UNH. A couple got married here in Portsmouth in 91, I think it was, and they were on the Phil Donahue show and talking about how they wanted their partner to be on their insurance. We had Sarah Louise, who was a transgender woman who started transitioning in 1985. And in 1989, she actually sued Blue Cross Blue Shield. She went down to Boston and protested in front of their main office. She did sue and she did settle out of court. And again, that made national news, and she was on a lot of talk shows. Anyway, that kind of struck us as wow, we were pretty active on the seacoast. And the other thing that we found interesting was the number of people that you could see going from one organization to another. For example, Wayne April, he was very involved in the GSO at UNH. Then we see him on the Seacoast Area Gay Alliance. Some of the organizations in Concord, we could see some people that just every year they were, or a couple of years they were on a different organization. And though, and I think the other thing, so I was involved in the ordinance in 1993, and I think at the time we really didn't consider ourselves activists. We were just like, oh, we just want an equal rights ordinance here in Portsmouth, and we really thought it was kind of going to be a slam dunk. Portsmouth was very liberal. We thought, oh, this is a town that's going to happen. This can happen here in Portsmouth. And I think a number of us were surprised by the vitriol that came out. And unfortunately, it did not pass in June at the city council. And then some of the opposition wanted it on the ballot in November, and we did not want it on the ballot. We don't think rights should be voted on. But it lost there too. So it was a great learning experience for sure. But it was eye-opening as well to see, here we were in Portsmouth, very liberal, very, there's a gay bar, there's a women's bar, there's a very active, alive and active LGBT community, and we couldn't get an ordinance passed. So, anyway.
I'm going to jump in there, Tom, and ask Carrie Moorhead to introduce herself and tell us a little bit, just like Tom did, about things you have been involved in as kind of a trailblazer in New Hampshire LGBTQ plus history.
Thanks, Holly, and thanks, Tom. And I want to thank all of you. There are so many participants on this call. It's really exciting to see this level of interest in this topic. And I just want to, well, I'll introduce myself. My name is Carrie Moorhead. I was born and raised in Dublin in Ireland in the 60s and 70s when it was, we used to refer to it as Holy Catholic Ireland. And then I left home at 17 and went to Belfast during the height of the Troubles. Again, that's sort of a euphemism for civil war. And that, in hindsight, has a lot to do with what drove me to do the kind of work that I did, because you can see what happens when certain kind of policies exist, where certain kinds of experiences are valued over other kinds of experiences. Identity in one regard is sort of more important or less important than other identities. And yet, so often it's really everybody wants the same thing, which is to be safe, to be happy, to be loved. I went back to Dublin to teach, and it was very clear I was hired by the nuns, because it's the only way to get a job in Ireland is to be hired by the church runs the schools for the most part, certainly in the 70s and 80s. So I left to come to America, which is the land of the free and the home of the brave, where gay people would be treated with dignity and respect and equality. That was the sort of logic I was using when I arrived. And of course, that wasn't really true. It probably was truer than it was in Ireland at the time. But I set a goal for myself, which was, if I've left home and everybody I know and love to be here, then I need to live the life that I want to live and let the chips fall where they may. And so as a result of that, I continue to act in ways that sort of create the world that you want to live in. I decided to work only in a place that had a non-discrimination policy that included sexual orientation. And after I got my green card in the lottery, which is a whole other subject, I got a job at UNH, where the non-discrimination policy had literally, the ink wasn't dry on it. I didn't quite realize that at the time, but July of 1988 was a month after it had been added into the catalogue by the then registrar. And it hadn't been well publicized, let's just say. So my first day at UNH, I told my now new supervisor that I was gay, and her response was basically, I'm okay with that, but don't tell our admin, because it's hard to get good help at $5 an hour. So that was my start at UNH. And just keep it brief, because I know, Holly, you're going to ask us questions, but I went on to start the Safe Zones program at UNH, which has now educated tens of thousands of students, really, and also created a leadership development mechanism by which many, many more students were trained in how to do panels and so forth, which we can talk about. I was a co-founder of Seacoast Outright back in the early 90s. And I was a co-conspirator with loads of people on loads of things. And I want to say that it is interesting to me that in the moment that we seem to be going backwards in time a little bit, that to be seen as a trailblazer is an honor, but it's also true that I was definitely seen as somebody who was creating trouble, a troublemaker more than a trailblazer. And I do think it's important to remember that when we started doing the kinds of things that we were doing, we were very much not embraced by the powers that be for our good work. And obviously that's a generalization. Some people were okay with that, some people weren't. And it wasn't always the straight folks that were the block, to be perfectly honest. Sometimes it was LGBT people who, for their own reasons, were in positions where they were terrified that they might be outed in the process of whatever movement was taking place. So I just want to start this by saying our history is very complicated and nuanced, and you have to think of context when you have these conversations. And I'm really honored to be a part of this discussion. Thank you.
Thank you so much, both of you, for your introductions and for that kind of context and framing of the discussion. I think when because of all of the things that you both have been involved in, it's easy to kind of sometimes use a little bit of shorthand. So I wanted to follow up a little bit. And for folks who don't know, first with Tom about the ordinance in 1993, if you
Mhm.
wanted to talk a bit more kind of about what that was for and who were the folks who were leading that, names that people might not know who were instrumental in that process in Portsmouth, and who might have gone on to do other things like you've mentioned.
Hmm, sure. Um, Carrie was there, I do believe. Um, Jim Splain, who was involved in politics his whole life. He was a state rep in the 70s and in the 80s, and he was involved. He was assistant mayor in Portsmouth and city councilor in Portsmouth. He was the one that kind of kicked it off and got a group of people together. It was a mixed group, I think. I don't know if we were all LGBTQ. Another person was Susie Colt. She was an attorney, so she was very helpful with doing the legality of an ordinance, writing an ordinance that could actually pass and be enforced. She's now running for state rep up in one of the northern districts. Um, so really quickly, the ordinance at the beginning was to say all businesses in Portsmouth can't discriminate based on sexual orientation. Unfortunately, New Hampshire law didn't enable a city to do that. So the ordinance came down to when the city hired somebody, that company had to agree to not discriminate based on sexual orientation. So what started as a very big ordinance that we wanted, we could only get a little part even, and that didn't pass. And the way an ordinance works, it goes to the city council. City council votes on ordinances, and they um, didn't pass it. We do have a video that we'll have soon at the Portsmouth Public Library of that whole evening, which was like hours and hours of testimony when we were there seeking to get that ordinance passed. And like I said, it didn't pass then, and some people put it on the ballot for November. It didn't pass then either. And that group kind of disbanded. We were just kind of a one shot, political group that came together. And like I said, I didn't really consider myself an activist, but I think like Carrie said, we were just trying to we were causing trouble. We were. We didn't necessarily always mean to cause trouble, but we did. And I can tell you stories about causing trouble at Liberty Mutual someday.
And Carrie, same question to you. In co-founding Seacoast outright, in safe zones, starting the pancake breakfast, working for domestic partner benefits at UNH, who were some of your allies and folks who were trailblazers in that work?
Well, one was Stephanie Thomas, the former registrar at the University of New Hampshire, who has since passed away, or she passed away very young, unfortunately. And she was somebody who got a lot done in a very New Hampshire way, not flashy in a sense, and but solid as a rock, very granite oriented. And she chipped away at a lot of things, but definitely an unsung hero, really. Other people that there's so many of us. There was a tag group at UNH. We call ourselves tag because it was the Tuesday afternoon group, and we used to laugh that it was a good thing that we didn't meet on Fridays. So we would get together as staff from all over the university, and Kim Billings was there, Peter Welsh was there, Paul Cody was there. So many of us that went on and were involved in the partner benefits movement to sort of again put some context to this. When we were deciding if you could use that kind of as though it was a really major deliberate conversation that was happening, there was always a tension between the people who were palatable to the greater masses and the people that were seen as the really edgier type LGBT type people, right? And so even within the community, some of us were not seen as gay enough by the gays and too gay by I'm obviously using shorthand here, but you know, someone like me, I would be not necessarily an acquired, I'd have to be an acquired taste by some of the people in the LGBT community who would have felt like I wasn't, you know, out there enough. So this idea of using incremental change, taking a policy and sort of working on that and then doing something else and building over time, which is sort of my approach, was not necessarily embraced by some people who said it's all wrong and we need to blow the whole thing up and start over, you know, and again, overplaying it to make a point here. And I do believe that there's good in terms of making LGBT progress over time. That is important to remember as well, that even within our own groups, we had to navigate this idea of, are we being too nice, or are we going to do this in a way that's going to put off the people that we need to have on our side to help us get through this? And so I think that gets a little lost, because the overarching narrative in the end is, we got partner benefits, we got gay marriage, we got all these things, but it was not a straight line, and it was not a simple thing. So sometimes the hardest conversations for me personally were the ones I was having with the LGBT friends of mine who were like, "You're not, it's not enough. You're not doing enough." So that you have to kind of unpack that in the end. But back to Seacoast Outright, Mim Easton, of course, Robin Albert. It was a mixed group. We had LGBTQIA folks from the get-go, which I think is, again, really important. Parents and friends of lesbians and gays. PFLAG was a group, and still is, obviously, who were very, very important to us. We started Seacoast Outright in the MUB, in the Granite State Room, really, at the Respect for All Youth Conference, which was a teachers conference for people in New Hampshire, teachers in New Hampshire, to learn about LGBTQ sort of issues broadly. And Portland Outright came down and were a panel at the end of that event. And it was in April, and we thought that we would be past snow season, but we weren't. It was a miserable, miserable day, and we still had a room full of people. Hundreds of people came to that, and it was incredible. And after that, 40 of us decided to say, right, we're going to go for it. We're going to start a Seacoast Outright here. And some people wanted to start the next day because the kids needed us, and there was an urgency. You have to remember, we were in the height of the AIDS crisis. Most people couldn't say gay without thinking of things that were not, you know, if you said gay and children in the same sentence, the first thing that came to mind was not kind, caring adults who really want the world to be a better place for kids. And so that's what we were up against. And we had Bob Carnan at the church in Portsmouth who said, yes, you can come and have your support group here, and we will give you space in that building out the back of the church. And that was hugely important to us, to be able to say, we're meeting in a church, for people to feel that this was a safe place and that the kids would be okay, in essence. And as I said, so, you know, Bob was a minister. For people who don't remember that name, he was a minister in Portsmouth at the time. And so, again, a mixed group of people came together, LGBTQ and A, and people who helped us to fundraise money to be able to keep that going. Early days when we had no staff, it was all volunteer led. And we spent 6 months pulling manuals together, putting policies together to ensure that we had a stability to the infrastructure. We had bylaws, we had UNH folks, in part, I will say, I'm biased because I was at UNH and we had a great degree of expertise to draw on, said, you know, in a combined way, we said, we're not just going to do this fly by night. We're not just going to open the door on Friday and make it up as we go along. That's not going to provide a sustainable structure for these kids. And here we are 30 years later, and Seacoast Outright, we had hoped at the time wouldn't be needed. You know, we sort of honestly all knew that that wouldn't likely be the case, but we created an infrastructure that I'm very proud of that still exists. And has grown. Other people have taken it on, but I think that's the sign of a really important work that had taken place in the first place, because it had legs and it was very thoughtfully done. And I hope people know that, you know, a lot of time and energy went into that. And again, that was a conversation we had to have with people, like, no, we need to do this right. And it will take a little bit of time, but it will be better in the long run.
That's great to hear that. process kind of from someone who was there as it was happening and who's still here to reflect on it 30 years later, more than 30 years later. Tom, Carrie just mentioned kind of the height of the AIDS crisis, and I know that the New Hampshire Seacoast LGBT project has received a lot of materials from different organizations that were involved in fighting AIDS. I wonder if you have anyone that you would want to lift up about work in that area in New Hampshire.
Sure, there's a number of people, but I'm going to re-mention Robert Albert that Carrie mentioned, who was involved in starting Seacoast Outright. She was also involved in starting AIDS Response to the Seacoast, which was the AIDS service organization in Portsmouth, and that started in '87. And again, it was like just like Outright, it was an all-volunteer organization. They really started just buddying people without AIDS with people with AIDS, and one of the people that was involved early on was Joe Murphy, and he actually started working for AIDS Response Seacoast in the mid-90s. And one of the things when you do get involved in different organizations, you realize some of the constraints that they have with the money that they have, and being a Portsmouth, New Hampshire-based organization, they couldn't really take people from Maine or from Massachusetts. And Joe is kind of like, this isn't right, and we need to do some training for everybody that comes through Portsmouth. We had people coming to the bars from Massachusetts and from Maine. So he and a couple other people started in 1995, I think it was, the Gay Men Fight AIDS. They call themselves the Lifeguards, and they did in-home trainings for gay men or men who have sex with men. I think it was a 3 or 4 week program where they just talk about how do you negotiate safer sex and all these things. And so he was very instrumental in that group, and they disbanded in 2017 actually, and we were around then because we started in 2015, so we have all of their records. I mean, being an anonymous kind of group, there's no participants' names and stuff like that, but we have all of their, program material and stuff. So somebody in the future can look at, say, oh, what were we doing here in Portsmouth for that? So there was a couple other people. Jerry Scapolatulo was another person that was involved in that, and I could go on and on. But
One of the things, and Joe Murphy also worked at UNH for
yeah, he did look at UNH for a while. Yeah, and
a
we do
while.
have his oral history, and unfortunately he passed away a couple years ago. And he was also involved in the Gay AA, the Alcoholics Anonymous organization that started in Durham in 1981, I believe it was. Late 70s, early 80s, and they eventually moved to Portsmouth, meeting at the church where Seacoast Outright met. And the first night that they met there, they had like 80 people show up. And they disbanded in 2019, and we have their records as well. So it's
Just a
definitely a lot
glimpse
going
of all of
on.
the material that's available through the History Project, which is amazing. I think because of our focus on UNH and on the Seacoast, it might seem that there isn't a lot of work going on kind of in other areas of New Hampshire. I wonder if either of you have folks or organizations that you would like to mention and tell people about who are from New Hampshire but outside of the Seacoast area.
We just recently gave a number of our artifacts to the New Hampshire Historical Society in Concord. We received a number of items from Fritz Bell, who was instrumental. If you follow him back, he helped start the first LGBTQ political organization in New Hampshire in 1979. And he became like an educator and did a lot of AIDS education in the 90s, etc. But they also they sent me, somebody was doing some research on the clubs in Manchester. So they researched all the LGBT clubs in Manchester in this huge list, and I think that might be available online, but that's an organization that does have some LGBTQ archives, and the another one we've dealt with was the Stonewall National Archives and Museum down in Fort Lauderdale. We sent them a number of books that we had collected that we just cataloged, and they were available, anywhere. So we didn't really need to keep them. But they have a huge library of all LGBTQ books. And if they get duplicates, they sell them to support themselves. So those are two. University of Southern Maine, we sent stuff up there too. So that was one of the greatest things about starting this organization, was making all these connections to other organizations that really need to have some of this material and really need to, open up their archives and say, our stories are just as important as anybody else's stories.
Yeah. Carrie?
Yeah, I think to Tom's point, I think he's really answered that. I think one of the questions is, do you put the LGBT stuff together, or do you include LGBT stuff in the history of that town or city or state or whatever? And our position, plurally here, because we've discussed it, is that we are the communities in which we live, and therefore our stories and our histories ought to be intermingled with the stories of any and every other group and person in those places. And so I think that's always also one of these struggles is how do you remember the story? What is the story? And my dissertation was for my PhD at UNH was based on Create Our Destiny conference, which we had. It was on campus. It was funded by some funding that came through from a national organization, and we were the only rural community in the country that had been granted funds because of our history. And I think again, this is this interesting question around how integrated you are. And so one of the things that you see as we look at the history, I'm going back in files now, working with Holly on some recording of stuff that I've got. I've donated a lot of stuff to the library already, but I've found some more. Is as Tom's mentioned, there used to be loads of gay bars around and women's bars around. Well, there aren't any of those around anymore, in part because we don't have to hide in gay bars, in a sense, so we can go in any place, hopefully in Portsmouth or Durham or any other place, and feel safe and comfortable. But there is a loss in that then of community, right? So if you're new and you come to, I often was the phone a friend for gay folks, LGBTQ folks. People call me and say, where do people go for X or Y? Well, it used to be fairly easy to say where people could go because those places were identified and fairly localized. And the answer now is it can be anywhere, but that's not necessarily a great answer if somebody doesn't already know people. So there's, again, the ebb and the flow of things. The good news is we're safer and arguably more integrated, and that also has this sense of a bit of loss of community at the same time.
That's a great point. Before I ask my next question, I want to remind everybody in the audience that you can put questions into the Q&A that will come to me as moderator, and I'll be able to ask our panelists your questions and get their responses. So don't hesitate to throw a question in the Q&A now if you are interested. But before we get to the Q&A, one of the things that occurred to me just now as you were talking, Carrie, and also Tom, we haven't talked at all about the arts community and kind of trailblazers in creating what we kind of know now as this thriving art community in the Seacoast and throughout New Hampshire. I wonder if you might want to share about people or events that were important in the kind of founding of that community.
I'll quickly tell the story of Melissa Week. She was involved in our ordinance fight in '93. Unfortunately, she passed away, and we received her archive. She was an artist. And when in '93, when we were working on the ordinance, some of what we really needed to do was to just convince people that gay people have been around forever. And she made these little pins, hand drew pins of, famous LGBTQ people, Leonardo da Vinci and, all these other people, and sold them. And it was a way to get, you know, things out there that we've been around, and um, we have her archives at the Athenaeum, and some of her artwork is there as well. But I think Carrie can maybe talk about the
Yeah, the
art.
art to go.
Yeah.
Yes, we at Seacoast Outright, we're looking for ideas of ways to create some fundraising opportunities so that we could keep the doors open. And Amy Adams and some others came. I think Robin obviously was involved in this, and Mim and others. And the concept was one that Amy had seen elsewhere, but brought to the Seacoast, where you go to local artists, and 50 artists were invited to provide 3 pieces of art each. Each of the artists were then given a ticket to the event. So that left 100 pieces of art, and the tickets were $100 a piece, which means that the organization would clear $10,000 on the night. The way that this event worked was you had your ticket, you walked in, you got a bingo number, basically, and you spent the first hour, hour and a half, 2 hours looking around at all the 150 pieces of art. And then as soon as the event started, the bingo numbers would be called, and you would then have 1 minute to pick a piece of art. And in the course of the next hour and a half, the entire gallery would then basically be dismantled, and the art would be going to new homes. And at the end of the night, everybody left with a piece of art, a sense of being a part of this great fundraising event. It provided a forum for artists to be able to show their work and show their support for Seacoast Outright and the LGBT community, and the food would be donated and so forth. And we used to have this around the place. It was held in multiple places, including the art gallery at UNH, and it was always a successful fundraiser. And then individual artists like Dean Diggins, who is a well-known artist, would also provide an additional piece of work for a bigger sort of prize, if you will, for a silent auction to raise a little bit more money as well. And so Tom and I were remembering that. I'm sure lots of people have lots of art to go work hanging around their house. And it was always a great community builder as well as a fundraiser.
That's fantastic. I know Tom has organized, as part of the Seacoast LGBT History Project, a yearly Rainbow Symposium in October during LGBTQ plus History Month. And some of the themes of those, or some of the people who've been panelists have either been around topic of arts community. There was one, I think, on food. Tom, I don't know if you want to mention
Yeah,
any of those individuals.
sure. It's a great topic there. And because it clears a couple points. When Carrie was talking about, we really wanted our stories to be part of the stories of the community and not separate. When I started, I didn't really know a lot of people at the Portsmouth Historical Society, so we thought, well, why don't we rent their space and do a rainbow symposium in October? And so that's what we did. So we could get to know those people and they could get to know us. And we did have a one panel on the restaurant industry in Portsmouth. And we had Buddy Haller, who came up from New York City in 1970 and opened the famous Blue Strawberry restaurant in Portsmouth without any restaurant knowledge or any business knowledge about running a restaurant. But it was very successful. He was around for 15 years, and people look back on that restaurant as really the start of the whole restaurant renaissance in Portsmouth. So we've had different panels throughout the year. The two We've had 2 of them where we just invited people that grew up in Portsmouth. The first one we did, we had somebody that was from the 50s, somebody from the 60s, 70s, and 80s, just talking about their experience, and then getting some Q&A. This year, finally, after, kind of working with the Historical Society for a few years, one of the things they first said was, I asked them, well, how do we just become part of you? Because we're telling stories too, and you're telling stories. And one of the women suggested, well, why don't you start a walking tour? So that's how it kind of started. So I lead a walking tour, but it's not the Seacoast History Project's walking tour. It's the Portsmouth Historical Society's walking tour. So they do all the um, advertising and collecting money and all that. Anyway, this is the first year that they're taking over the Rainbow Symposium, which is really what we wanted from the beginning. So it's a great start to, I think, a new relationship with them. And this one is all about, the one coming up this year is all about, the importance of archiving and maintaining the LGBTQ history in the Seacoast and actually around the world. But
That is a perfect transition, Tom, into our Q&A, because one of the questions asked in the Q&A is, what are some of the things we can visit in the area? Museums, walking tours, etc. So check out the Portsmouth Historical Society, Tom's walking tour. There's one coming up October 20th, I think, Rainbow Symposium
Monday.
on the 23rd. And there's also the Portsmouth Public Library, as you mentioned, that has the oral history recordings and other audio video files from the history project. Another question that came in the Q&A is, I'll direct towards Carrie, and that is, what would be considered UNH's biggest defining moment in LGBTQ history, in your opinion?
Wow. Now that is an interesting question to think about. I suppose if you think about back to the lawsuit in the 70s, that has to be an anchor piece, because that was so quintessential. The student gay group tried to get recognition. They were denied. The case went to the Supreme Court of the state of New Hampshire and became a precedent-setting case for gay, straight alliance or LGBTQ groups all over the country. And we celebrate that event every year during the Pancake Breakfast, which has now been going on for over 30 years. And that helps to highlight the LGBT history. To Tom's point, we've got to keep these stories alive. That's what Holly's doing in her oral histories and so forth. So we have endeavored to continue to remind people that we make incremental progress in a given year, but the arc overall should hopefully look positive. Things are heading in a good direction. So I have to say that has to be right there. Having said that, I think there's big and small things that we could look back on. The Matt Shepard event, when Matt Shepard was killed, and we held a vigil and walked around Durham and held a vigil inside then, over, not in the Granite State Room, which is where a lot of this stuff took place, but in the Stratford Room, and that was a full house. We packed out the movie theater in the MUB. Those of you who know where the movie theater was, that was built while I was there in the MUB, so that was not always there. If you predate the 80s in UNH, then the theaters wouldn't have been there. But when Ellen came out, we had an Ellen Comes Out TV watch party, and that was incredible because it was a full house. And I remember distinctly being at the student activity fee meeting the first time a police officer was not in the budget for the CGLBA group. Up until 1992, every time the gay kids had a dance, there had to be a police officer paid for in the budget. And that's not something that maybe people would fly the flag over, but to me, that's a hugely important moment to remember, that that's not that long ago when if you had a dance, you had to have a police presence. And we may not think about that now, and because it's no longer a thing, thankfully. But again, not too long ago. So there's lots of big and small things. I do think one of my proudest sort of achievements, if you will, is to have gone from being the person that might scare off an admin to being the dean of the grad school. That certainly wasn't on my bingo square when I got to UNH. That was inconceivable, to be honest, to be a dean or a provost or any other major leadership position, and that again is not the first thing that would come to people's minds, but the fact that that could happen, and the announcement that went out about me in the role of the dean of the grad school was not, it didn't come up. That's sort of the good news and the bad news, that it didn't come up, that I was what we're, I'm tongue in cheek here, but a trailblazer in LGBT work. It just was a thing. And I still got the job, which again, people would not necessarily have thought possible. So I think it's a great question and lots of things to be proud of there.
I think just to quickly answer a question in the Q&A myself, someone asked, do we have photos or videos of the folks at UNH GSO in the early 70s? And that is something I am working hard on. Of course, not everyone carried a camera around in their pocket all the time, and a lot fewer photos exist, but I will direct people to the archive and special collections at the UNH library, where you can see the work of some of the amazing students in Intro to LGBTQ plus studies who over the past couple of years have been doing research on the GSO and its founding and founders. And there are library guides and other resources there where you can see photos, and including the entire archive of the New Hampshire newspaper, where you can follow the lawsuits and court cases through the 70s. So
Holly, just a quick mention that there was also that show that was done on PBS called, it was season 1, episode 6 that the UNH story was featured, and it was called We'll Meet Again, the series. And our two of our original trailblazers from back in the day were both featured in that, Wayne April and Paul Tosi, looking to find him. Yeah, it's a fascinating piece, and you can, I think, in that see some pictures of them.
Great point, Carrie. Either through your local PBS station or logging in through the UNH library, you can access the full episode. One question from the chat is, what has been the most surprising piece of history uncovered? I'll direct that one at Tom.
Wow. That's a great question. What comes to mind is not necessarily a surprising thing, but two things come to mind. One is people don't think their stuff is worth saving. We were at a Portsmouth Pride meeting once, and this woman came up and said, started talking to us. She said, I don't have anything. And her partner came over and said, what about that big box of stuff you have in the closet from the, Women in the Mountains club that you had going? And I'm like, that's exactly what we want, I think there are two things that surprised us. One was when we were setting up our exhibit in 2019, celebrating the 50th anniversary of Stonewall, and we were displaying our stuff. Somebody came in with a piece of glass panel from a door, and it said Sagamore Republican Club, and he asked us if we wanted it. We said, of course we do. And it was that the Sagamore Club, which was the first gay bar in Portsmouth, met at the same place that the Sagamore Republican Club did, and the same place that the Acropolis Greek Club did. So that was kind of a piece of history that, had we not been in the paper or been out there, this guy might have just thrown it away. He found it in the attic when they were rehabbing the building that the Sagamore Club was in. And another one was, again, a sign from the Iris Women's Club that was in Portsmouth from 1980 to 1988. Somebody saw a piece on the walking tour, and then I include the Iris Club and talk about that. And he contacted the Historical Society and said, I have this sign that's been hanging up in my barn for 40 years. Would you like it? And it was one of the signs from the Iris Bar. So what surprised me was that those things existed. And I think the other thing that surprised me was probably the Charlie Howard story. I won't get into the story, but it was that there was no marker on his grave. you know, and when Sarah found that out and she really wanted us to do something, and it was kind of not really in our purview, but we did a GoFundMe anyway. We said, sure, we'll put a marker on his grave. He was born and raised in Portsmouth. He was killed in Bangor, Maine in 1984 because he was gay. And they have a really nice memorial there for him. And we raised enough money that we could buy a marker for his grave. He's buried in Kittery, Maine. And so we put a marker on his grave. And we had enough money to put up 2 memorial benches. One we put up at the high school, and the Gender Sexuality Alliance did the whole program and dedicated that bench there. And then we have one in downtown Portsmouth that we dedicated in 2022. Those were some things that surprised me. What surprised me about Charlie Howard was there was a lot of information about his death and what happened in Maine afterwards. There was very little about what was he like here in Portsmouth. You know, what did he like to do? Where did he hang out? What was his favorite song? What did he do in high school? You know, and we found a ton of information about him, and it's all in the archive now. But that was a good surprise that we had a lot of the pictures and even some handwritten notes that he had written when he was in high school.
That's great. I'm glad you mentioned Charlie Howard. And if people don't know his story, do go look it up. And there are resources out there, including from the History Project, to help you do so. I have 3 questions that I'm kind of going to combine together that are kind of interested in the current moment and kind of and also looking towards the future. Kind of how has the LGBTQ visibility and representation evolved at UNH? Kind of what is the state now, and looking at kind of where we are now, what are some of the bigger issues that are facing the community? Can this kind of look backward into history help us look forward, and guide us in the current moment, and just kind of combining with that, just to complicate matters further and putting too many questions all at once to you. You know, folks who are recent alums or who are current students who might not be finding their community, who might struggle to find their community. Any thoughts about places or events or ways that people can find their community today?
I think it's a great question, and I do think it will evolve over time. There've been ebbs and flows on really active stuff. We've had multiple organizations pop up, like Queer Campus was around really for a long time, and then it disappeared depending on how political people wanted to be. You know, LGBT groups are often, to simplify it, either more on the social end of bringing people together so that they can get to know and meet others, and then on the other hand, trying to make social change. And some people like more or less of each of those things. So new groups spawn all the time. I'd like to give a shout out to some work one of our grad school students did recently to reach out to Riverwoods, which I thought was a really nice current sort of situation where UNH continues to help to provide leadership and opportunity to folks in the community now to learn about what it means to be LGBT and how to be supportive and so on and so forth. But I'm gone now, so I've only been 6 months, but I'd also hesitate to say too much about what's happening, other than I do think that this is a challenging moment in time politically, and that we need to recognize that. Sorry, my phone's ringing. Yeah, so it's an interesting time nationally, and I do fear a little bit that the national politics around some of the kinds of things that might appear in front of the Supreme Court now after Dobbs could really have a severe impact on LGBT people.
I would reiterate that, and I think part of what we have to do is know our history. because you can hear the people saying the same things about trans people that they said about gay people back in the 70s with Anita Bryant. It's the same rhetoric. What about the kids? What about the kids? And fortunately, children are so accepting. But I do think it's hard to find the community in Portsmouth. And I'm just thinking, like 30 years ago, if somebody asked me, like, oh, how do I get involved with the gay community? I could list off 10 organizations and say, here you go. Do you want to go here? You go there. And I think what I'm seeing, which I like, is a need for that physical getting together. And I don't have all the details because I'm just learning about it and just meeting the people that are younger than myself, which is pretty much anybody, but they are starting things like Les Hang, and creating a monthly event or something where people can come together. Maybe it's just at a park and bring a picnic. But I think there's a need for that physical contact and not just the over the internet contact. So I think the new generation is going to create some new groups. I know Seacoast Gay Men is still going on, and they're meeting in Kittery now, but they started in '79 and they're still meeting. Outright, I think, is a great support group and they can, channel kids and do various things. It is interesting that here in Portsmouth, we actually have a GSO organization in our elementary school that started a couple of years ago. So there's some positive things happening, but I think, at the national level, it's pretty scary. But I think if we look back on history and say, they've done this to us before and they lost, they're going to lose again, It's going to take a fight and it's going to take time. And it's unfortunate that we have to waste resources on struggling for things that we thought we already had.
Yeah.
Tom, I'm glad you mentioned Seacoast Outright again, because it reminded me in the Q&A, someone did ask, is Seacoast Outright still around? And the answer is a resounding yes. They're still around. They're still happy for folks to support them. They were also, I think, instrumental in creating Portsmouth Pride, which now happens every June, and is a wonderful kind of intergenerational event. Okay, so
And they're busy encouraging people to vote right now.
yeah.
I noticed the posts. I know you want to get to Larry, Holly, so we'll leave it
No,
there.
I was also just going to mention another thing that I think is related to Seacoast Outright or grew out of Seacoast Outright. There is a mailing list newsletter called the Outboard, which I think people can sign up for, and that is full of social events, all sorts of events that people might want to get connected with in the community. So that's another resource. But yes, Carrie, you mentioned Larry Meacham, and I would like to introduce UNH alum Larry Meacham, to tell people about to introduce himself and to tell people about a new alum affinity group.
Thank you, Holly. And it's a pleasure to join this and to be on the same call with Carrie and Tom. So appreciated. A few years back, I realized that those of us who had gone to the University of New Hampshire had either graduated or not, for that matter. There really wasn't an LGBTQIA plus affinity group. And so we did our research initially to ensure that we weren't duplicating any groups that may be there. And we found out there wasn't an ongoing alumni group. So we, with about 5 other people, set up a board. We established through the alumni office our affinity group, which is basically to coordinate, brainstorm, and enhance the growth of the affinity group. So we welcome everybody to participate in it, be they alumni, allies, faculty, or for that matter, graduate or undergraduate students who are in the process of graduating. So we are really looking forward to that type of participation. And I know one of the questions was related to from a recent grad, and I think this potentially provides that avenue for that recent grad to participate. We also realized this was a three-pronged effort. We also realized that it's important to have an actual fund, in addition to one that was already established, the Kidder Fund, to actually have opportunities for programming. As you can well imagine, there are still, in today's current environment, we must have gone through at least 10 iterations of what our purpose was before we settled on the purpose. We're very happy with what was finally decided. We are in the process, it's only been since June, of setting up the initial 50,000 for the fund, which is required by the university. And I am happy to say that I think that we will meet our goal 6 months early. I think that we will have the 50,000 by the end of the year. I'm still waiting on some stats, and I know some funding is still going in. So very, very excited about that. So basically, we're here. We encourage your participation. I think today's event is a fine opportunity to lead into the affinity group, and just want to thank everyone for giving me the opportunity to talk about it.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Larry, for sharing about that. And Larry, you have been working on coordinating another webinar that
Thank
people
you.
might be interested in hearing about.
Thank you. Yes, it fits in with some of the questions that actually you got in the Q&A. On November 18th at noon Eastern Time or 9 a.m. Pacific Time, we have Pride in Politics, and it's basically navigating LGBTQIA plus advocacy in New Hampshire. We currently have on, and we may be growing the panelists, but we currently have a UNH alum from the Washington Blade. We have a representative from 603 Equality, and we also have an undergraduate student and are looking for a graduate student to have that interaction from that perspective as well. So I encourage all of you, certainly who have participated in this, to join us on November 18th at noon Eastern Time. Thank you, Holly.
Thank you so much, Larry. Thank you to Carrie and to Tom. Also, thank you to Alexander for hosting and Jen Woodside for coordinating us all. And especially thank you to everyone who has joined us. We're going to quickly be shut out of the platform. So I just want to say thank you to everyone and wish everyone the best. And it's a great day to be a Wildcat.